So good evening, welcome to Georgetown on this wonderful occasion. My name is Gerd Nonneman, I'm Professor of International Relations here and Gulf Studies. Been here 13 years, initially as Dean. One of the things that I always was proud of was our engagement with the world out there in Doha and the world at large, where we'd be able to bring together people from across the globe and across Qatar and engage in discussion about really significant issues, politics, history, economics, you name it. COVID, as I was saying earlier in our Majlis discussion, COVID kind of ruined all of that, but we're back, and we're back with a serious bang. We're having His Excellency Gilbert Houngbo here with us, Director General of the ILO. So this is the kind of thing that if you're based here, you can expect a lot more of. We had a discussion on Iran and Saudi Arabia just the other day. We're having a major conference hosted at the Four Seasons in a couple of days on the 20 years after the invasion of Iraq and all the regional repercussions. And there's a whole series of other things that are coming along. So keep your eyes on the website of Georgetown University, Qatar. It's easy. If you don't know it, simply Google Georgetown Qatar events, and it'll all pop up. Unfortunately, we can't put your names on our lists. You have to do this yourselves, and it's very easy through the system. Apparently, there's some legal restriction on us doing it for you. But anyway, so look out for these things. So let me now introduce our speaker. In some ways, of course, he doesn't need an introduction, but still, I think it's worth saying a little bit about the background, the journey that brought him to this current position, and a real trajectory, a real track record of service. He is, of course, a citizen of Togo, was born in Togo, and has degrees in business management from the University of Lomé, and then accounting and finance from the University of Quebec. So starting out in a technocratic kind of fashion, he then joined PwC Canada between 1986 and 93. And then after a stint as finance director of the International Bank of Mali, which is, I think, the biggest banking network in Mali, he moved to UNDP, and that's where his history of service, in a sense, starts. So we'll have someone with a strong technocratic background moving into service, which made me think it would be a perfect Hoya, a perfect Georgetown, member of Georgetown with its values, which is all about people trying to get the kind of skills base and then be of service to one's community. After that stint as finance director of the International Bank of Mali, he moved to UNDP, as I was saying, and then he served there for 12 years, rising to the positions of assistant administrator and assistant secretary general, in fact, as well as regional director for Africa of UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. And then in 2008, this is perhaps something some of you didn't know, he was asked to serve as Prime Minister of Togo, which is another kind of service. It's, as far as I know, he didn't set out as a career ambition to be Prime Minister, but he was asked to step in, and serve as Prime Minister, a role he served in for 4 years. And it's at that point, after his term as PM in 2013, that he joined the ILO as Deputy Director General for Field Operations. Since 2017, he has also been President of the International Fund for Agricultural Development and Chair of the United Nations Coordination Mechanism for Water and Sanitation. And then, of course, in 2022, he was elected by the ILO's governing body as its 11th Director General, and incidentally, the first African to hold that position. So you've come here to hear from him rather than myself, so we're going to hand over to His Excellency now. He will speak for perhaps 20, 25 minutes. We'll see how that goes. And then we'll have a brief discussion, talking about a few questions, and then we'll throw it open to all of you. So without further ado, sir.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you so much, first of all, for this very kind introductory word, and thank you so much for inviting me for this session, which I truly consider as a privilege for somebody like me to have to come to, again, Georgetown and having this dialogue. And when we talk about dialogue in ILO, we always talk about social dialogue, which is one of the pillar of what we stand for. And you know, ILO is International Labour Organization, International Labour Office. Sometimes quite confusing. Let me quickly say that the ILO is the organization, like any organization, and the office is the secretariat of the organization. So sometimes we confuse ILO, but so I head the office, and the organization itself has its unique structure, which is the tripartite, we call it, structure, meaning that we have 187 member states that are member of the organization. Then we have the patronat, the private sector, represented through the employers' organizations, and we have the union, the trade unions, and that also have the third part. So it's really an institution with three legs on that, and the decisions in terms of voting power, 50% of the voting authority is with the member states, and 25% with the employers, and 25% with the workers, the trade union. So sometimes you can get confused that such a decision was made by UNICEF or by UNESCO because only member states are voting. But in ILO, may be a different decision because the social partners also have 50% because they represent also, if I may say so, the real economy on that, to make sure that we really make decisions that are all inclusive. So with this, I can come back to it if necessary in terms of explaining who we are. You know, you give me this opportunity to speak to you. Coincidentally, just coming back from New Delhi on the G20 summit, and next Tuesday I will be in New York. Actually, from Sunday I will be in New York for the UN General Assembly, and as you know, with the 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, being the SDG summit and the whole assembly, it's in general. So having the occasion to speak to you between those two major events, which are really part of the global multilateral event, is quite an opportunity to reflect on the scale of the global challenge that we face and the world face today. And it is an opportunity to underline the importance of national and multilateral action on decent employment, reflect on policies that can deliver sustainable reductions in poverty, reduction in inequalities, and also reflect on the just transitions. And I'm insisting on the plural side of the just transitions, so that we can tackle all these integrated challenges that we face. So I will focus my remarks, if I may, on three major preoccupations that I carry with me as I'm heading to New York to exchange with and the leaders of this planet. The first is the scale of the global challenges we face. The second is the need to address the fault lines in our labor markets and the structural inequalities that undermine sustainable development and that threatens the stability of our societies and of our economies. And my third point will be our global ambition, particularly for multilateral cooperation and some of ILO's initiatives in this regard. So, my first point is that despite our exit from COVID-19, as you just referred to, we continue to face compounding crises and sweeping transformations that pose significant challenges to our effort to advance social justice as the precondition for peace and stability. Geopolitical instability has taken a heavy toll on the social economic situation in many countries. And the economic outlook remains highly uneven and also uncertain. While global food and energy prices have fallen from their peak levels, we know that we continue to see a rise in the cost of living in so many countries. And interestingly, whether it's from the global north or the global south. The tightening of global financial conditions risks pushing countries that are already vulnerable into financial distress and provoking, amongst other things, a debt crisis. There is a risk that this will continue to contribute to an increase in the type of internal democratic instability that we have seen taking place in some countries, and so doing exacerbating poverty and suffering. Climate change is also provoking extreme weather events, increased frequency and intensity in those events, causing dislocation, and our heart goes to the victim in the earthquake in Morocco, the flood in Libya, and so on. And we know, and we are seeing the consequence of those climate change-related disasters. And that will certainly, and is certainly causing much more economic insecurity. These compounding crises occur at a moment in which transformative technologies, including AI, are reshaping our economies, reshaping our societies. The ILO recently released a study on the likely effect of generative AI, such as the chat GPT, and the effects on employment. And it projects that AI will probably augment the productivity of more jobs than it replaces outright. But there is still likely to be major economic and social dislocation. Therefore, societies will need to invest heavily in the scaling and the transitions of workers if they want to avoid serious social tension. People must receive the support they need to adapt to the changes coming to many occupations, particularly in the service sector. Societies will also have to adapt their governance frameworks to ensure that these technologies are developed and are applied in a human-centered fashion. These challenging times provide many reminders that social justice is the best guarantee of lasting peace. Yet the realities of so many people's lives leave them with the perception that we are on a trajectory leading away from social justice, calling the sustainability of peace and stability into question. My second point is that decent work is key in advancing social justice. And decent work brings together the social, the economic, and the environmental dimensions. As one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 8 sets out to promote, I'm quoting here, promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. End of quote. Decent work is based on respect for fundamental principles and rights at work. I mean, freedom of association and the effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining. I mean, the elimination of all forms of forced labor or compulsory labor. The effective abolition of child labor, the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. These are universal rights member states of the ILO commit to protect them for all of their workforce, including the informal economy and the migrant workers. This enables work with dignity, irrespective of where or by whom that work is carried out. Having a decent job provides people with the means to ensure an adequate standard of living for themselves and their families, and to secure improvements in these conditions. It's a route out of poverty. This is essential for making progress on the environmental dimension. When families are preoccupied with how they will put food on the table or how to pay their bills at the end of the month, they are less likely to support the difficult transformations that will be needed to achieve global environmental targets. Decent work provides opportunities for productive engagement and participation in one's workplace, community, society, and economy. In addition to these social and environmental dimensions, decent work is a catalyst that can create a virtuous circle of increasing productivity, rising living standards, and sustainable enterprises and economies. And yet, the reality today is that the fallout from COVID-19 pandemic and the compounding crisis we now face have significantly delayed and in many instances reverse the progress made in advancing social justice and securing decent work. Labor market insecurity is quite widespread. According to the 2023 ILO World Employment and Social Outlook, the global jobs gap, which measures the unmet need for employment, stood at 473 million people in 2022. Yet, global employment is projected to expand by only 1% this year compared to 2.3% in 2022. Unemployment rates are much higher among young people aged 15 to 24 than adults. Moreover, nearly 1 in 4 young people are not in education nor in employment or training. Many of those that do not have work do so without labor and social protection. Those that have the work, in other words, the quality of the work is at stake. Around 2 billion workers, which represent 58% of all those employed, are in the informal employment. And these workers are twice as likely to live in poverty than those in the formal economy. In our effort to tackle global poverty, the fact that the growth in informal employment outpaced formal employment in the period following the pandemic is a deeply worrying trend. Add to this the expansion of new and frequently insecure working arrangements, including the platform work, and we have significantly deficit in opportunities for decent work in those platform work. This heightened the economic insecurity is compounded by policy agendas that have left more than 4 billion people excluded from any form of social protection. So half of the population has zero protection. They have no access to health care, no access to any kind of sickness benefit, no support that might assist them to feed, to clothe, or care for their children, and no access to income in their old age or during period of unemployment. Related to this is the issue of rising inequality. Income inequality has increased in a majority of countries. In high-income countries, a key factor driving this increase is the growing inequality in wages, with large gains for the top of the distribution and stagnating wages for workers at the bottom. In low-income countries, the significant share of informal work with low earnings and a high incidence of poverty contributes to high level of inequality. Irrespective of the level of development, there is a gap between men and women. Globally, women earn approximately 20% less than men. And these pay gaps are even wider when gender intersects with other grounds of discrimination, such as race, disability, migrant status, etc. Alongside these trends, average real wage growth has lagged behind average labor productivity growth, particularly in high-income countries. What this means is that rather than creating a virtuous circle, workers are, on average, receiving a smaller share of the economic growth. And as one of our ILO reports to be released next week will show, these fault lines are structural inequalities. These fault lines and structural inequalities mean that we are, unfortunately, off track when it comes to SDG 8, which, as I mentioned earlier, covers inclusive growth and decent work. We must change the course if we have any hope of making progress, not only in respect of decent work, but sustainable development more broadly. These are opportunities, there are opportunities ahead to transform the informal, unproductive, and unprotected work into jobs that lift families out of poverty, to expand the coverage of social protection, and to deliver net gains in green jobs through just transitions. This will require cooperation and balanced partnership between employers, workers, and government, founded on respect for fundamental principles and rights at work. And it will require global cooperation. It is useful to recall a principle stated in the preamble of ILO's founding constitution, and I quote, "The failure of any nation to adopt humane conditions of labor is an obstacle in the way of other nations which desire to improve the conditions of their own countries," end of quote. This brings me to my third point, which concerns our global ambition, and this must be commensurate with the scale of the challenge we face. It requires a challenge, concerted effort at the multilateral level to tackle the global challenges that I have outlined earlier and put us back on track to realize the 2030 agenda. Yet, at the very time that we need enhanced global cooperation, the world has become more fragmented. We have to recognize it, with shifting poles of power and influence. An increasing number of regions and countries are legitimately expecting to have an equal say in global decision making. And this makes multilateralism both more difficult and more essential than ever before. So at the ILO, we will be harnessing our unique tripartite convening power to form a global coalition with other key actors, including, obviously, the multilateral system, to advance social justice while strengthening policy coherence at a global level. Related to that effort, the ILO is leading the coordination of the UN Global Accelerator on Jobs and Social Protection for Just Transitions, which was launched by the Secretary General Gutierrez in September 2021. It signals the UN system's common ambition to address challenges in jobs and social protection. In respect of transformational technologies, the ILO has been mandated to organize a standard-setting discussion on decent work in the platform economy in what we call a double discussion, which i.e. a process that will take at least 2 years, 2025, 2026, to really determine if there is a need to legislate at the international level on the platform economy as related to the world of work. 2025 will also be the year in which the UN's World Social Summit is expected to take place, and the ILO is planning to publish the first edition of a major new report on the state of social justice in the world. It is my first conviction that it is only by advancing social justice and by promoting decent work for all that we will change the trajectory that we are currently on and place the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals within reach. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, thank you for that, this kind of tour d'horizon, which on the one hand puts a few accents and kind of gives some insights about trajectories, but on the other hand seems also to be quite pessimistic. I mean, you want to put hope and direction, but it came across as a little pessimistic. In some respects, you said we're on the wrong track, or we're going backwards in some respects, and that immediately draws me to, or reminded me of the meeting you just came back from in Delhi, the G20, where I was struck by the tone of the ITUC, the International Trade Unions Congress, reaction, which was very negative, where they're saying our key concerns haven't even been touched upon, let alone seriously addressed. How do you see that, or how does the ILO react to something like this? Do you see this G20 meeting as something that brought some positives, or is it indeed a retrograde step?
No, clearly I would not say that there has been any kind of regression on that. You know, if you look at the G20, and for that matter of fact, the G7 processes, which are two very good examples of multilateral processes, we always have a level of frustration of issues not addressed or not sufficiently addressed. At the same time, a lot of excitement for issues that also are addressed, or the direction in which we are. This G20 under the Indian leadership, from ILO perspective, I have to say that we were quite very impressed and very pleased to the attention accorded to the whole protection, both in terms of social security protection, social protection in general, and the skills, and you know, the skill, and that is linked to also the mobility of the migrant workers, whether it's a skill recognition and the need to develop a worldwide new curricula that, or a common platform of the different criteria of recognition of degrees, and you in the academia world, you certainly very familiar with that. All those technical things for us has been very good. On the global, even at the political level, obviously we all know that the current crisis with the aggression of Ukraine by Russia polarize the discussion in the G20. And obviously that is still there. It doesn't make the things any easier. But that being said, it's still a very important forum for the leaders to talk to each other. That social dialogue or political dialogue, for me, it's quite priceless. And also, we have three major themes: one planet, one family, and one future. And to keep the whole environment and climate change agenda high on the agenda of the G20, now G21, representing at least 80% of the world economy is crucial, reminding each of them there ahead of the COP28 in Dubai, or really looking at the societal transformation under one family was also powerful, let alone talking about the future with what I was saying, the fragmentation that we have now. Everybody knows that it's helping none of us. And from the geopolitical side to the technology side, where all the excitement and the preoccupations that the artificial intelligence is causing is quite. So I think there has been, but for me, and maybe I'm too old in the multilateral system, we are in a system where, you have to. It's like development. You have to accept that sometimes you make 3 steps, although you know that you could have made 5. But and even sometimes you have to accept making 1 step backward, as we say in French, reculer pour mieux sauter. Make 1 step backward so that you can jump to the 3rd step next time. The most important, I usually compare that to the Wall Street charts. You always are back, but the most important thing is to see over time an improvement, and I think we are. I'm hopeful anyway.
Very glad to hear it. But I suppose that takes me to another question that you touched upon at the very beginning of your talk about the nature of the ILO as a very peculiar kind of international organization. Yes, states are members, but so are representatives of trade unions and representatives of employers. So the judgment on the G20, I quoted the ITUC, so I suppose it just shows different perspectives are held by different people in this whole question. How does that in practice work in the ILO? So how do these different stakeholders with quite divergent or different agendas and interests, how does one bring them together? How does consensus emerge? I know there's the voting thing, the 50%, 25-25. Can you give us a flavor of how that works and perhaps sometimes doesn't work?
Very briefly, because I can spend 2 hours on this. It's important to keep in mind that ILO was created in 1919 through the Traité de Versailles. It's the Traité de Versailles who created ILO, which is part of the outcome of the First World War, which is one. And 1919 is 2 years after 1917. In 1917, I'm pretty much sure all of you know what's happening in Russia with the Bolshevik revolution. So it was very clear to everybody from the government, and this is why you look at ILO constitution. It says that if you want lasting peace, cultivate social justice. So it was very clear, both from the government, for the aristocracy at that time, let's call it today business community, and the workers, that in fine, the progress can only happen and sustain if the three put their head together, despite fundamental diversions. So that has been the beginning of having this kind of very unique organization and governance structure. And it's, yes, legally it's important to know that the government have 50%, 25 for the what we call the social partners. But our principle is, apart from the election for a new director general, we do, and the conventions, we do every effort not to have to vote.
Mm-hmm.
So, which means, despite that, all three parties place a great importance to the social dialogue. So for us, and for me, so rich, you could see confrontation and sometimes, sleepless nights between the workers and the employers, even the government not always in the same line, but at the end, we will manage to find a solution that is consensus-based. And it's not necessarily like a minimum denominator approach on that. And yes, sometimes it might take 2 years to agree on things that maybe you will hope to have agreed in 6 months on that. And sometimes we may fail to have an agreement, but there's this popular saying, I think, in some part of the world, that okay, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, let's go together. And this is really what ILO does. And I hope that responds a little bit to the, and of course, our primarily responsibility is to set up conventions, the standard, the norms for the world of work. And today we have almost close to 200 norms, that 192, I think, that we have set up since early 1920s. And today some of them are automatic, that we don't even think that are based on norms set up by ILO. One of it is the working hours, and the fact that it's decent to have a weekend on that. All of those are based on convention, of course, child labor, forced labor, equal pay for in terms of the gender-related issues. The recent one, violence against at the place of work, and the workplace harassment, and all of that. We have it all to help. And so you set up the conventions, the standards. Secondly, of course, you advocate for their ratification, because the parliament and the each at the national level need to ratify them. We do have a very independent, supervisory and control mechanism to ensure that member states are implementing the convention that they have ratified on that. And if they don't, we do have coercive measures. We are not a tribunal, and we cannot just wake up and take a sanction on a country, but we do have means that will really incentivize those that are having problems to solve those problems. And the third thing is, we do have a major part of our global setup is the technical assistance to help the country. It's not just a matter of pointing countries that, oh, you should ratify that, but, or you have this problem and shame on you. It's also working with the authorities, working with the social partners in the given countries to help them either implement the conventions or address the challenges that they are facing.
So that makes a lot of sense, and it also reminds me of the example of Qatar, where we happen to be. I know you didn't come specifically to discuss Qatar, but it's sort of an inevitable direction of thought for many in the audience, I'm sure, because precisely that seems to have happened, right? So the ILO was, although people often don't remember this, was actually a significant critic. They really had a case against Qatar's lack of follow-through of implementation of labor standards. And then the ILO opened an office here and actually worked with Qatar. So what I'd like, just to a global, putting Qatar in a global context, the ILO looks at all of these 187 countries. Where would you situate Qatar in that sort of global picture. How do you see it's evolved, and where might it be going? What trajectory do you sense, or does the organization sense, that Qatar is on?
No, of course, in Qatar, what is quite interesting, maybe there are three dimensions that I will say. The issue that were brought to the face of the world are related to migrant workers. But we in ILO, when we are working with the Qatari authority, is all labor-related matters, including but not limited to the migrant workers on that, which is one point that I think is interesting to say. The second point, which I find that quite fascinating, if you look at globally how the world operates, when there is a major event in a country, all of us, rightfully or wrongfully, we can debate. All of us want to use that major visible event to push some important matters. And I think since it has been announced that Qatar is going to organize the World Cup 2022, obviously that has brought the country to much more scrutiny and visibility. Ironically, it doesn't mean that Qatar has a situation that is worse than others. But it's just like you have an event and people, the international community, etc., will use that possibility, which is a third point where Qatar is that we opened our office in 2018. It is quite interesting. Since the time we opened our office here, we from ILO has always seen from the government, a very determination to address issues when the issues are raised. I want to be very clear on that, including this visit the last 2 days that I've been here. The willingness, the positive attitude of the government, the Ministry of Labor, and today yesterday I had a very good exchange with the Prime Minister, and last time I was here I also met with beyond the Ministry of Labor. You can see that the Qatari authorities, they see what they need to do or they want to do as part of the 2030 agenda. And now I remember the Prime Minister saying that, sooner or later we even need to go beyond 2030 on that. The challenge we have, and by the way, is a challenge that we have in all the Gulf countries, it's not limited to Qatar, is how do we ensure, obviously you have seen an increased mass of the migrant workers arriving in Qatar or in the neighboring countries. And the kafala system, clearly you could come to the conclusion that it came to a point where it's not the best, it was not in sync with the reality that you have. So that's, we have to change that. And that's why we have worked with the authorities to put in place a lot of reforms. Start with the passport confiscation, or the changing the regulation on the heat stress, the minimum wages, and the dispute resolution. A lot of things were put into place. But and you mentioned it. I was privileged to serve 4 years as Prime Minister in a country that were in a democratic crisis at the time, coming out of internal severe problems. And I can tell you, I'm not telling you in theory, in really practice. When you do the reform and you put new laws, what is much more difficult is the implementation. The devil is always in the detail. And we have that in Qatar, that the devil is in the detail, and you. So my point is that on one hand, we know, we have to be very clear, the government has put in a lot of reform and a lot of winning, etc. on that. But it doesn't mean that there's no more problem. It doesn't mean that there's no more challenges on that. And that's why. And I remember both the Ministry of Labor and the Prime Minister telling me that when I was there here in December, I think, that we want to continue working with you after the World Cup. For us, it's really our Vision 2030. And as a matter of fact, Sunday and yesterday, we have a huge almost conclusion between ILO and the international ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation, and what we call the GOVs, the Global Union Federation, which are the international sectorial. ITUC is the global. Then you have the sectorial international trade union like ITF, which is the International Transport Federation, for example, BWI, which is building wood sector. You have the entertainment sector, you have different sectors. They all were here Sunday and yesterday working with the Ministry of Labor and ILO, preparing for the third phase of our cooperation that will start in January, where we want to deepen the implementation and the lesson learned from the last 5 years. How do we improve that on one hand? And second hand, the government is very much interested in working with ILO in working on the skill dimension also for the Qatari, and how do we adjust that to the need of the labor market, not only now, but in the coming years. So globally, there are progress. We want to continue working on the progress, but we recognize that there are issues that are still ahead of us. And I just don't know if there's one single country that could say that they don't have any labor-related challenges.
Sure, of course. I know there's going to be comments and questions in the audience. I just want to make one final point here briefly. You were quoted recently in a BBC article saying that on youth labor globally, things are going in the wrong direction, or child labor. Could you say just a few words about that?
No, on the child labor, which is quite frankly a bit frustrating for ILO, the world has been making a lot of progress in child labor, and ILO has put in the past 15 years, if not more, a major program of the elimination of international program on the elimination of child labor, with a lot of concrete numbers going down. But COVID, unfortunately, has caused a very negative impact, to the point where the numbers again are stalling, if not reversing. And today we talk about 160 million children that have been used for work and labor instead of being at school or at play, and mostly in the agriculture sector on that. So this is why we are really reactivating and redynamizing our efforts, working with the different authorities to make sure that we can step up our. Obviously, the child labor conundrum is quite very much linked with the state of development, the level of poverty on that. So the more you fight poverty, you have that kind of effect on the positive effect on the child labor dimension. So it's again something that I'm glad you raising it. We want to make sure that particularly on the worst form of child labor on that, and which is and again, I'm taking too much time. Child labor is part of what, and I mentioned that what we consider in ILO, what we called fundamental principle and right at work. And child labor and forced labor are part of that, as well as discrimination on the basis of gender or any other criteria. And those fundamental conventions have to be implemented, adhered to, whether or not the country has ratified them, because they are so fundamental. on that. So it's very important that there's no excuse. A country cannot say that I did not ratify this and therefore I cannot be held accountable on that.
Thank you. So I know there's a few mics around. Maybe if we take a first round of questions, perhaps 4 questions or so, or interventions. Yep, we'll have one of our, and if you briefly identify yourself. So we'll have one, let me see if there's anybody else, and the gentleman in the front here. And trouble is I kind of blinded by, yes, the gentleman there at the 4th row. So let's start with these 3. And did I see, yes, my colleague, Professor Irulo. That's 4, great.
Hi, I'm Carlo. I'm a student here at Georgetown. I believe we have met earlier at the Majlis. But anyway, so just before I give the question, I'll just give you a context. So basically, Qatar's labor reforms is being praised for making it less restrictive for migrant workers to change their jobs when they are being fired. Like, you don't need an NOC from an employer to move to another situation too. And another situation that I want to raise up is the recent push of the ILO to promote gig economy and platform workers, like their rights rather than leaving them in the gray zone. Now, I want to ask, is the ILO doing something specifically concerning the ability to access, for the ability of migrant workers to take part in the gig economy when there are recent developments here in Qatar that appears to be placing restrictions on that movement? Like, for example, if my status here in Qatar, I can only work in particular field, whatever's listed in my Qatar ID. If I want to be an Uber driver, that requires me a special I either need to change my employment in my Qatar ID, which takes away some privileges, plus the fact that there's also recent regulations that cars should be clearly marked as for limousines only, rather than in other places there, if you have a car and you can drive, you can just participate in Uber. So is this something that's being discussed with the Qatari government or not, or whatever?
Okay, so and then perhaps if you could pass it to Professor Irulo, who's close by.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'm going to ask a more general question and see, how it relates specifically to the ILO, and it points to some of the issues that you raised in your speech. So the field of international organization begins or kicked off with the most important question, which is, do international organizations matter? And I'm asking this question because we have some students in the audience who, take a class on international organizations. We start off by saying, oh, they do matter, but I notice that they end up being very pessimistic about the role of international organization, especially when it comes to the relationship, the vicious cycle between the secretariats and the member states, which are 2 different things, like you stated. The fact that member states create these international organizations have to regulate them, and then member states have to give international organizations authority. So in your position, how do you navigate this vicious circle?
And then I think the gentleman in the front here, yes.
Evening, and my name is Ghulam Asmal, and I'm the South African ambassador to Qatar. Thank you very much for a very informative address. Recently, we've seen 2 very significant events with regard to multilateralism and socio-economic justice, and that is the enlargement of BRICS and the addition and the admission of the African Union to the G20, making the G21. I think these events, what precipitated this is primarily dissatisfaction with the marginalization of the global South and their concerns, and an attempt to make the agenda, the international agenda, more relevant to addressing issues in this country. Does this necessarily mean that ILO has to reassess its modus operandi? And secondly, do other multilateral organizations also have to do this? And secondly, my last question is that I'm quite intrigued that during your address, you talked about the reduction of poverty. Is that not a very unambitious target? Because I thought the Global South is talking about the eradication of apartheid, of poverty. Thank you.
And then the gentleman at the back there in row four. Yes. Yes, sir.
Hello, Your Excellency. This is Mohammed Al-Hawal. It's wonderful having you here. My question is as follows. The ILO and the Ministry of Labor have cooperated into introducing major reforms in migrant workers and laborers in general. There's always room for improvement, such as the introduction of minimum wage, as well as the restriction of working heat. How can we bolster this cooperation further? What is the next step?
There's quite a bit to get your teeth into.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much for this this first round. The first question, I believe there's 3 or 4 issues in one on that. The one that is a bit difficult for me to give you with authority is what is related to national practices or laws as it's set up. Each country has its way of dealing with this change of ID, etc. And I can see the same type of issue in other countries that we are also working for. However, the word for me is quite important is the status of migrant workers and the ability to change jobs or to change sector, which when I compare that to 10 years ago in Qatar has been quite major changes and major improvement. There's still, from where ILO sees it, there is some challenges. It depends also because you see the way a country like Qatar or any other country in the region, for example, is organized. It's also dependent on the process of the country of origin on that and the associated costs. If you are an employer in Qatar that you have spent some money in the process of getting migrant workers, it's also of concern that if overnight you don't have that, like you have wasted your money on that, we need to recognize that the employers also concerned are not baseless on that. So the government and Ministry of Labor and the government need to find a very good way to handle this kind of what I call the mobility dimension of it. It's another a good example in listening to you that progress, when I talk about progress made, yet challenges remain. I think you are just proving that in that case. And the gig economy, the region in general, and the Qatari authority in particular, the impression that I get is one of the sectors they are planning to invest more in, and therefore I would just only encourage you to not to give up in your ambition to be or trying to focus on the gig economy. The question that you were on the second question on the pessimism that the international institutions are facing, and on one hand this pessimism has been there for a while. At the same token, which is much more worrisome for me, is the fact that it has increased in recent years to the point where major part of the world, the youth or the academia or the civil society are sometimes questioning the value of multilateralism. And we have seen even at the head of state level, leaders questioning the need for multilateralism. The jury is out there, and for once I can tell you that I feel much at liberty to have those type of debates. And sometimes it's not necessarily a good comparison, but I compare that a little bit to the debate sometimes we have around the police. On one hand, sometimes the police will act in a way that we all will be unhappy, and even maybe more than unhappy. On the flip side, we also know that we cannot live without the police service on that. I'm not so sure, and I may be biased because I'm from the system. But the little I know from the system, and I've been in that system since '96, I'm not so sure that the world today will be better without the multilateralism. Mm-hmm. Yet the multilateralism has its own weaknesses. Believe you me, myself, I'm frustrated sometimes when I see that, I can go fast, we can go fast, yet you need to accept going slower because you need to bring everybody together. Particularly, and that linked to, I think, the third question actually, particularly when you look at the new geopolitics, power games that are reshaping, and we have the announcement of the enlargement of the BRICS. Yet, if you really follow carefully during the G20 last weekend and some of the parallel events, you can also see some responses here and there in the political setup. But fundamentally, the multilateralism, and a perfect example was the COVID. I really wonder how you would have managed this world if we didn't have multilateralism during the COVID era. And all those conflicts we have today in the world, I'm sorry to say that we will end up by sitting around the table to negotiate peace. And that, you need the multilateralism. And despite the frustration, and I'm very much conscious on that. I mean, generally speaking, in all our systems, including ILO, I'm not hiding it. It takes too long to fill a post, to hire, because of our system on that. If, in the private sector today, you go for the best candidate, that's it, on that. But for me, I need to look for the best candidate, but I also need to make sure that all the regions are represented. Otherwise, I cannot operate. And I also, of course, other criteria. I'm just using that as an example. So it's you really need to continue being skillful, and that's why those programs of international political economy for me is quite crucial, and we're going to need that more and more in this world that is in evolution on that. I mean, I was already touching on the question of the enlargement of the BRICS and those geopolitics. From where I sit and the way I see it, one of the discussions that keep coming at the G20, including the G20, is the not only the importance of what the IMF is trying to do to make sure that there's a reallocation of the special drawing right, the SDR, on that. And there has been during the weekend a lot of voices. But saying that what we're talking about is not just reallocating the SDR. It's a matter of revisiting the share of the power of the governance of IMF, of the governance of the World Bank, of the governance. So you could see that, quite frankly, the global South most of the institutions, of course including ILO, most of the institutions in the multilateral have been created at a time where a lot of countries, including where we are today, were still under colonization. And today they do have authority, they do have sovereignty, and they see the world differently, and that poses a new challenge. This is what direction that we have to take or not to take. And sooner or later, I believe that has to be discussed. And this is part of this, the skepticism. Those of you that are involved or are following the reform of the UN Security Council. How many years that has been on the table? But one day it will happen. This is where the frustration has to go with the, I wouldn't tell you if it will happen before or after my retirement, but I know it will happen because we can't continue as it is. The poverty, whether I talk about reduction of poverty instead of eradication, you made me really smile. Way back more than 20 years ago when I was in UNDP, those are the debates we used to have. So, and I was, or I am, I don't know what I should say. Let's say I was on your side, meaning that is eradication. So maybe I'm getting old, and then I'm passing now from eradication to the reduction or alleviation. The more important thing for me is, first of all, eradicating extreme poverty. That one for me, eradicating it. And once you have eradicated extreme poverty, then to increase the bar of what we consider extreme poverty. And then to eradicate that again. And today we use what, 2.14 or whatever dollar for, there's a lot of economists in the room that will correct me, and that we use as extreme poverty. You know, for me it has to be $5, it has to be $10, and that is really where I see the progress. And while doing that, making sure that the inequalities, we keep the level of inequality under control. The ILO and the Ministry of Labor, in terms of what's next step, I almost touched a lot on it. The next step, one big thing is to continue in deepening the implementation of the reforms. What we have been doing with the Ministry of Labor, continuing deepening in that, which is one big major block. Another major block is the whole skill development and skill matching, and including providing also trying to see how one best respond to the need of the Qatari youth. On that is also one big thing, and also looking at how do we. I know the Qatari authorities are also considering ratifying new conventions, and we will work also with that on that. We do believe that anyway that next phase will start at the beginning of next year.
Thank you very much. I'm aware that there's probably other people who would have liked to come in, but we've got to well beyond our time, and the questions and the answers were so comprehensive and interesting that I've got a feeling, I don't feel too bad about concluding the proceedings now, especially in light of the fact that our speaker specially postponed his flight to tonight in order to be able to give this presentation, to have this discussion with all of us, for which I'm incredibly grateful, and so are all of us. So many thanks to all of you, and many thanks to you.